My girlfriend and I were eager to explore and each took 20 pills, 300 milligrams each, for our first time, and it turned out that we were both very susceptible to the drug. So much to our surprise, we both were KO'd in bed for at least 8 hours, and we couldn't walk straight for a full 12 hours. I'd like to describe what happened when I decided to take a higher dose. It had been 2 weeks since we'd taken DXM. It was my third time trying it, and I was feeling very hopeful that I'd have a blast. I definitely entered the experience and the come up with a positive mindset. I downed 2 350 mg bottles in 15 minutes, failing to completely finish the second bottle, so I would place my dose at about 600 to 700 mg. Because I'm exceptionally susceptible to the drug, this is comparable to a much higher dose. My girlfriend and I are of nearly identical weight, 135 pounds, height, 5'6", age, 19, and drug history involving a single light use of MDMA about a month prior. T0. Took DXM in a comfortable apartment with just me and my girlfriend, who I trust implicitly. Stress-free and open mindset. Well hydrated. D+15 minutes. During the start of the come-up I had the typical effects of impaired motor control, difficulty focusing, and slightly slurred speech. This happened for approximately 15 minutes. We played video games until we were too impaired and SSBM was just too much to handle. D+30 minutes. At this point, I experienced extreme motor impairment. Moving my head caused streaks, an effect I get rather quickly with all sorts of drugs. We decided to go to the bedroom and drink more water, use the bathroom, and get ready to enter our own worlds. We lied in bed and kissed for a bit. I would compare this stage to being very intoxicated. D+1 hour. I experienced a euphoric feeling in my legs. My limbs were heavy, but moving my legs in a running motion felt very euphoric. This feeling is a common effect with DXM, and one that I had been waiting on, so I enjoyed it quite a bit. I can only hope we weren't moaning too loudly, it was pretty pleasurable. One other important thing to note is that we experienced near total numbness in our feet at about this same time. D+1 hour and 30 minutes. At this point I had my first "how long have I been doing this" moment, the first of many. DXM affects my memory in astonishing ways. I said to my girlfriend, "How long have we been doing this?" She replied with a "whoa, holy shit," and we both looked over to the clock and saw that it hadn't even been too long. The urge to move our legs began to fade. We both became lethargic and the real trip began. D+2 to 6 hours. This is when the peak of the trip began. My girlfriend and I started experiencing closed-eye visuals and entering what we call daydreams in our heads, scenarios that pop out of nowhere from our past or subconscious that play out, almost for fun, right before our eyes. My imaginary state nearly always involves my girlfriend, because I think about her most of the time. I'd close my eyes, see the ceiling, realize my eyes were closed, open my eyes, look around, realize where I was, and then go right back into the daydreams. I'd say incoherent sentences to my girlfriend like "remember the parking lot we kissed in?" and other silly stuff that give us a lot of good vibes during this stage of the trip. I'd find myself playing hide and seek with my friends at age 12, or going on a romantic date with my girlfriend a year ago. These hallucinations occurred without any physical sensation. They were mostly visual and logical. I was prepared to lose myself, just like the other times. And I definitely did. For hours it just piled up. Describing the physical sensations I had is difficult. I would describe sound as reverberating in the sense that as soon as I heard a noise or a word, it would run through my head and I would spend an eternity living out the experience. I've been told that this is due to DXM's effects on the hippocampus. Touch was completely numbed. Like being wasted on alcohol, I could only feel taps of feeling. I couldn't move, I was too weak. My arms felt like sticks. I didn't focus on my body, that's what dissociatives do. I just lost myself in the rhythm and the reverb of everything. It was truly intense. D+ approximately 6 hours. I had a bit of a scary moment as I began the most intense part of my trip. My body suddenly felt cold, I felt like there was a cold piece of metal deep in my chest. I knew instantly that this was what a bad trip felt like, and I immediately told myself what I needed to hear: "You'll be fine in 30 seconds, you've done this before, it's a fun experience." But the feeling didn't go away. I began to have terrible, racing thoughts that I was about to die. That I needed to call an ambulance. I remembered that I'd taken MDMA less than a month ago. What if there was some kind of serotonin syndrome happening? I was convinced that I was going to die if I didn't get help. The feeling was true terror. I leaned over to my girlfriend and muttered something about overdosing and MDMA interactions. She looked at me with a terrified expression, and said, "Please don't say that, please don't say that, please don't say that," over and over. I could tell I just made her feel as terrified as me. I suddenly felt the urge to vomit. Luckily we'd placed a trash can right next to the bed in case of nausea. I gagged a couple times, then threw up DXM. I had taken it on an empty stomach, and I hadn't hydrated enough. The exact moment I finished puking, I felt amazing. I felt so warm compared to the icy terror. I told my girlfriend, "I feel so good now, I just had to puke, it's so good now, I feel great," and she was visibly relieved and our panic attack vanished. But I did something I shouldn't have. I removed my glasses when I was puking. When I lied back down, I was completely blind. I have such bad vision that I can only see things an inch away from my face. I lied down and closed my eyes. I saw the ceiling, clear as if I was sober. A couple of hours later, I entered the scariest headspace of my life. plus approximately 8 hours. I'll describe what happened next from my perspective and then from my girlfriend's. She had begun to sober up around the 8-hour mark. She later told me that I seemed as though I was just sleeping and she talked to me a little. I was still tripping hard, and beginning to experience things I never expected. In my mind, I was experiencing strange abstract situations that had no bearing on my life at all. The view from our window captivated my mind for a bit. Even though I couldn't even open my eyes, I was flying around the city imagining Godzilla was fighting some weird planes. When I think hard, I can associate this picture with my impressions of some SNES games from my childhood. plus approximately 10 hours. I entered a strange world of pure reverberation. I couldn't see or touch or heard anything. I saw one color, white. I don't remember any shapes, but I'm sure that there were some ripples and some objects that may have appeared in my mind. There was no sound. I didn't know what was going on because there was no me. This wasn't a memory, it was pure sensory dissociation. I can't even begin to describe it. It was every possible feeling and at the same time, I felt nothing. This was ego death. I had no conception of time. According to my girlfriend, I spent nearly 3 hours in this state. I'm certain that at this dosage, experiences are unique. Suddenly I heard noise. I tried desperately to focus on it. I remember the fear I felt in that moment. I imagined myself in a hospital, nurses shouting at me to keep breathing. I just heard a voice, that's all. I was certain that I was going to die of serotonin syndrome. I didn't feel myself breathing. I couldn't feel my body, I didn't have a body. There was just my consciousness and dead space all around me. The next moment I had visuals. I saw colors other than white and the terror slightly lifted. But only slightly. I was still so afraid, I didn't know what I was looking at. I couldn't understand the voice. I knew I was being shaken. I also knew that someone was trying to talk to me, to get me to say stuff. So I tried to interact. I don't know what came out of my mouth. I didn't know anything at that point. This lasted for some time. Then, I was staring at the wall for a bit, when I suddenly realized that it was a wall. I realized I was in a room. That my girlfriend had just walked back in. Girlfriend. I remembered her name. That this was her place. She saw me and came to the bed. She tried talking to me but I didn't understand what she was saying. I tried asking her questions about where I was, who I was, why was I here, do I love you, why can't I remember anything, etc. She looked at me and seemed very nervous. She said, "You were saying gibberish," the first words I understood. "I am?" I said, to which she laughed. I assumed that I was still speaking gibberish. She said, "Do you know where you are?" I said something in reply. I don't know what. I tried to communicate all of my feelings, but the look she gave me told me that I had just spoken more gibberish to her. "Do you know where you are? Can you tell me your name?" I replied again, trying to tell her that I didn't know who I was, that I thought I had died. Nothing good came out. This went on for about an hour, apparently. I started mixing in words, surrounded by complete and utter gibberish. I was literally speaking in tongues. She took a video and showed me afterwards. It was absolutely shocking how truly gone I was. DXM is one hell of a drug. I'm scared you took too much. It's been 12 hours. She offered me water, and I couldn't sit up. This thought made me truly scared and I started crying. I tried talking through tears but just more gibberish came. I couldn't hear the words that came out of my mouth, of course. There was no disconnect for me between thought and speech. She started talking about our times together, trying to get me to respond. I don't remember much from this point on. Apparently I fell back asleep for about 30 minutes. Around 1 a.m. When I woke back up again, it was the same way. Suddenly, A voice and shapes materialize out of the overwhelming white static. I again didn't know where I was, and I was back to square one. She did it all again. This time, I could move, and I made it to the living room. I drank water. Sometimes, I'd mix in a word of gibberish with my sentences, or just suddenly make no sense and start rambling like a toddler, speaking nonsense words, according to my girlfriend. For me, it was a confusing and shocking experience. I felt as if I had just been born at 19 years old. This is not a metaphor. I felt as if I had woken up in a room with a stranger. Like this was my entire life, like I was born in that room. My long-term memories, my relationship, my fucking childhood, the emotions, the sensations, the details. Everything is just a shadow or disappeared entirely. I went back to sleep for an hour. Woke up again, started speaking gibberish to her again for 5 minutes. She was really scared at that point, so was I, but from then on, the effects wore off. I could walk around capably at 16 hours. At 24, I felt sober, but changed. This experience erased who I was. I will never try DXM or any similar dissociative ever again. It's been almost 2 months and I'm still piecing together the fragments of my shattered personality. Everything special to me has been rendered alien by this drug. I just want to be me again. I feel so disconnected from my past now. The special moments that I clung to for meaning, for my entire life, suddenly lost their intensity this one night. A brief little history: I am 17 years old, a senior in high school. This whole senior year has been all about me demolishing boundaries, social and mental. The mental aspect gets done through my experimentation with psychoactive substances. My best friend, pseudonym narrator, had been indulging in drugs for a bit longer than I. For some months, he had been open with me about his use and had gently offered to include me on several occasions, all of which I had denied him. But eventually, something inside me gave in, and in August of '07 I finally let him smoke me out with some of the finest bud from our green state of Oregon. The mind alteration got me hooked, and in a short time I was moving on to many other substances and surpassing him and nearly everyone else I knew in my intake and confidence with all manner of drugs. I quickly realized that my athletic frame, and whatever other factors, allowed me to consume a considerable amount of whatever substance with no adverse effects. I have been lucky enough to have no real bad trips, and any mildly unpleasant ones I tend to be able to redirect into positive territory. Through the months, I've done many varieties of marijuana, played around with Adderall, nutmeg, nitrous, morning glory, with success, mushrooms, diphenhydramine, dimenhydrinate, OxyContin, Vicodin, crack cocaine, and several others that escape me at the moment. However, few of these substances can hold a candle to my most beloved drug of all, one with which I've had incredible success and dozens of truly profound experiences. The drug being, of course, DXM. This particular substance was introduced to me in February by a very close friend of mine, someone I know and care about like a little sister. She had obtained some carcinogens, had told me what she knew about them and how they made her feel. However, I decided to do my own research, which I do for all substances that catch my interest. Rather quickly, I learned everything there is about DXM, and through many experiences, I developed a prodigal tolerance and wisdom with the drug. Ask any drug user at school, and they will all confirm that I am the authority on DXM, and that they have noticed a drastic change for the better in me. I'm not stupid with the drug, or irresponsible, but I deeply enjoy what it does for me. I have had tons of trips, most of them in mid to high third plateau doses, which for me means around 800 to 1200 milligrams. As an experienced DXM user should know, however, is that the elusive fourth plateau can sometimes be very difficult to reach, or to remember after being reached. Fortunately for me, about 2 weeks ago, I succeeded with flying colors. The night of the experience, it was a Friday night at my home. The days prior I had spent reading numerous fourth plateau experiences posted by veteran users. On one such report, I encountered a useful piece of advice to help maintain a sort of mental clarity during the experience. A member on a forum said to try using the supplements vitamin B complex and ginkgo biloba prior to tripping. He said they would help keep a more defined sense of consciousness about you, and that when employed they would greatly improve your memory during and following the experience. As luck would have it, my mom had both of these supplements in her collection. So I took several of each in the morning, again in the afternoon, and once more before my DXM doses. I had 4 bottles of Robitussin long-acting syrup in my possession for the experience, each one containing approximately 360 mg of DXM, with no other unpleasant ingredients, of course. At about 7 p.m., I drank 3 of these bottles in quick succession, a total of about 1,080 mg. This has always been very easy for me. I have never gotten nauseous from any DXM product, which a lot of my friends marvel at. With those 3 down, I munched on an apple to neutralize the taste of the syrup on my tongue, and went out to my living room to watch some basketball. The game ended at around 8:30, and at this time I got up and traveled back to my room. I was feeling a very slight buzz from the alcohol contained in those bottles, maybe 3 shots worth. As far as the DXM, I was starting to feel some of the preliminary indicators, but nothing really noteworthy to me. In my room, I locked my door, turned on my favorite fan and a lamp, opened a decoy book should my mom knock, and rested my eyes while awaiting the bigger effects. By 9 p.m., I was feeling a solid second plateau experience, my signal to take the last remaining Robitussin. I downed it, went to my side table drawer and got one of my many drug notebooks, and opened it up to a blank page, prepared to write, something I love to do whenever possible. My 4th plateau trip, as I see it, truly began around 10 p.m. By that time, I had turned my lamp off, since it was getting a bit late to have it on and because light hardly seemed necessary once my vision became more inner reality than outer reality. What follows is my memories of my 4th plateau journey. The experience, the way I remember realizing I had entered the 4th plateau is this: for about 30 minutes straight or so, I had been laying down with eyes closed, enthralled with the intense 3rd plateau imagery cascading through my mind. As DXM doses go higher and higher for me, the images in my mind begin to gain more and more definition, starting out as mere vivid ideas, gaining substance with that hard-to-describe mental sight, until closing my eyes feels like teleporting into a new world of shapes, colors, movement, and actual objects or people standing before me. So I had been off in a consciousness of this sort for a good while, when the feeling of my heart beating woke me out of it. I opened my eyes in reaction, and what I saw amazed me. First of all, the act of opening my eyes had never been so different than this occasion. Opening them was like looking through one of those kaleidoscopic binocular toys and changing the slide on it. It was a drastically choppy and intense experience to open the eyes, not the gentle materializing of reality like normal, but a sudden shift. Once the shift had happened, my eyes focused on my room, which had never looked more bizarre. I have several posters on my wall of basketball players, pictures of waves from different surfing areas, and a few framed records from retro California bands like the Beach Boys and Jan and Dean. The posters and records did not shimmer brilliantly like they often do when I look at them on smaller doses of DXM. Rather, they formed 3-dimensional frames of themselves, as they were all duplicated many times upon one another. My stereoscopic vision, which allows the eyes to focus on images and to not see double, was in ruins. I was seeing double in many different fields of vision, so that hanging images on my walls were superimposed many times upon themselves and one another, creating an extremely chaotic sense of seeing. With vision so far removed from its original functions, I blinked several times to try to restore it somewhat. All this did was trigger several other alterations to the things I saw. The posters and records next began to orbit one another in a furious clockwise frenzy. Vision was so utterly crazy, it was very hard to focus the eyes. So I stopped trying. What this did, as I recall, was cause my world around me to begin sinking together into the general middle of my room, like there was a sinkhole on my wall. I decided to try and take inventory of the rest of my room and the changes it had undergone. Turning my attention away from the alarming wall, I gazed up at my ceiling, which I discovered had also changed shape dramatically. It was pointed like a church steeple, and the weirdest part was the actual point at the top wasn't visible because it seemed to stretch up into the heavens. Looking towards my closet, I saw that a little section of wall that protrudes by the corner of my closet towards my door had grown considerably, blocking any view of my door. My window, with the blinds slightly open, appeared gnarled and iridescent. My bed itself appeared to have grown more than double its size, so that my body lay in the middle of a mammoth-sized mattress that struck me more as a sailboat, hence my report's title, than anything else. As I finished taking the scenery of room in, I once again realized that my heart seemed to be beating very fast, similar to how it gets on Adderall rather than DXM. I set to calming it down, by taking in some deep breaths, which I could scarcely feel, and putting my hands upon my chest, trying to soothe it to a more regular beat. Much to my immense shock, when I laid my hands on my chest, I had the distinct sensation of my heart and chest shrinking away to nothingness, until what my hands were on felt like nothing more than a plate. I literally could not feel my heartbeat. I tried touching my leg next, and discovered that it too shrank and disappeared from my senses. That's when I realized that my mind was so disassociated that the feeling coming from my body was more delusion than anything else. It didn't alarm me, being alarmed was kind of past my mental capacity. Instead, this feeling of detachment from body feeling kind of comforted me. I still had the presence of mind to remember that I had taken DXM and that what I was experiencing was undoubtedly some fourth plateau sensations. The next thing I remember from this period was the fan operating dependably on the side of the bed. I didn't actually look at it as movement of the neck was out of the question, but I suddenly became very aware of the noise of it. Only the sounds coming from it no longer resembled what I would associate with a fan at all. Instead, it produced incredible varied and involved guitar-like noises, complex and totally alien to me. I still have no explanation as to how I managed to hear such sounds that I have never before heard. Like I said, it sounded similar to a guitar, but like a guitar from another dimension, with bizarre twanging and flanging, many different frequencies and chords if you will. Much later in the night, I recall, the same fan abandoned the music-like sound and instead took to broadcasting the strangest voice-like noises one can imagine. I began to equate it to a radio sending transmissions from outer space entities. Try to imagine that. However, I'm grateful for the fan being on all night, because I believe it contributed to me keeping conscious and as alert as possible. I spent probably an hour or so with my eyes open, observing what I could and trying to extract meaning from what I saw. Remember, this whole time since I entered the fourth plateau, my mind had taken on a completely different persona. Looking back on it, I was very far removed from the self I know so well. This was actually very fun because it broke down all the barriers in my thinking. Nothing that I thought or imagined seemed based on anything prior to what was happening at that moment. Nothing hinged on predispositions, prejudices, beliefs, or any other inner block that all regularly functioning people carry with them wherever they go. All that I thought seemed in reaction to an outside influence I couldn't identify. A mind so very free of all restraints, that it wanders lost. In such a state, it can be hard to keep focus with some things. In a way, it's like being a newborn baby, where every experience out there seems new and profound and infinitely deep. This results in a short attention span of sorts. I soon found myself back in my mind, in vivid worlds and systems of delusional thinking. Soon, the barrier between inner and outer reality seemed to vanish as the difference between eyes open and closed became irrelevant. I began to experience what I would later term the China doll effect, in which my mind would have an imagination, and within that imagination would form a new, deeper delusion. Within that delusion, I would discover another, even deeper imagination, hallucination, dream, whatever you would like to call it. After enough of these, I would find myself in a deeply multi-layered false reality, further removed from true existence than ever in my life. True reality held no consequence, and the realities I experienced, although often rather abstract or otherwise impossible to articulate, seemed infinitely deeper and more eternally preserved than what human existence amounts to. This made me begin to reevaluate the concept of heaven entirely. It seems that most people view heaven as a paradise-like extension of life on earth, with people walking around with everlasting joy, with all the possessions and sources of joy they have always longed for. However, upon experiencing this deep-seated form of reality in the fourth plateau, I experienced an all-new kind of contentment that I would argue you could easily characterize like heaven. Very hard to put into words, and with good reason. Wouldn't it be reasonable to think that a state of heaven, nirvana, whatever, would defy description in this way? I also happen to believe that this sort of state is the one that commonly occurs at the fourth plateau, but that often becomes forgotten when the experience has ended due to its rich complexity. However, the ginkgo biloba, said to heighten mental focus and processing, and the vitamin B complex, said to improve vision and similar brain mechanisms, seem to do the trick in allowing me to retain that part of the experience. From here, I began to sink into all sorts of dreamscapes and involved delusions, occasionally coming back to reality, where my room would always be altered greatly, and often the delusions would continue out there. For example, I began to feel movement coming from different corners in my bed, like there was something or someone fidgeting around. Interestingly, my body itself still had almost no feeling, and yet I could sense feeling from these other imaginary sources. Very strange. At one point during the night, I had an out-of-body experience, which I have had previously with DXM. At the time, I was off in a dream world, when I opened my eyes to discover I was on my ceiling. I looked down to see my catatonic-like body laying several feet beneath me. I had the ability to move around in this state if I made the mental effort to, rather than try to physically move. The whole out-of-body thing has always struck me as fascinating. One could theorize it as evidence of a spirit or soul. Perhaps, when the body and mind are so thoroughly anesthetized, it allows the spirit/soul to emerge from the body, free of earthly restraints. Just a thought. Anyway, the night from here seems rather blurry to my current recollection. What I do remember, amazingly, was that the night seemed to encompass several days. Seriously. I remember waking once and thinking it might have all been a dream, until I noticed the tamper-evident rings from the Robitussin bottles I had donned on my thumbs. When I finally regained a sense of permanent consciousness at about 10 a.m., more than 12 hours later, I discovered I was still experiencing some vivid second plateau effects, such as a very shimmery altered vision and occasional off-kilter thoughts I have grown to easily identify as DXM-induced. I also found that I was incredibly shaky. That persisted for about 3 more hours, although it went undetected by peers. I found the notebook I had opened at the beginning of the night, and saw that I had only managed a small page worth of writing before throwing the notebook aside. One of the lines I had written, in frightening handwriting, was, "I see a man walking free. Walking free out of a pool, out of a planet, out of a brain. This man brings me peace of mind, I admire him greatly." Lol, funny stuff. I sat back and reflected on the night for much of that day. I had some great epiphanies and experiences, although some of them have faded into ambiguity with time. But my sense of heavenly China doll reality remains, as does some of the craziest hallucinations this side of diphenhydramine. JK, those suck. After having informed myself extensively about DXM, I finally decided to try it. I don't personally know any other users, and none of my friends were willing to try it. Therefore I was slightly nervous and anxious, but also excited. I used to frequently drink alcohol, but for the last few months I have solely smoked marijuana, for certain periods on a daily basis. DXM has made me reconsider my marijuana use in general, and especially the frequency. But to the trip. It was a Saturday evening, and all day I had been playing a computer game, the first time in ages. It was really enjoyable. So in the evening I decided to try out DXM. The Robitussin honey cough syrup had been in my weed stash for weeks already. That night I felt ready for the experience. Since it was my first experience, I intended to go on a first plateau level, possibly light second plateau. I did not plan to smoke that night, but well, things just developed. So at 7 o'clock, I kept a trip logbook, at least while I was in a physical state permitting me to type. I downed half the bottle, 10 mg per 5 ml. My room was only illuminated by a black light and some plasma lights. At the beginning the computer screen was on too, got annoying later on. The music of my choice for this night was to be techno, long hard trance mixes. After about an hour I started noticing effects. When I tried to walk I had slight problems. I felt drunk, yet not really drunk. The music was very intense. I turned on my strobe light, it got even better. The more time passed the more it became like a combination of smoking and drinking, yet without the depressing effects. My mind felt so free and lifted, not at all blurred, I could think clearly. Another notable and pleasant effect was a slight euphoria. Very pleasant. In fact, the only unpleasant effect during the entire night was a very slight feeling of nausea during the first half hour after having drunk the bottle. I might add that I did not eat much that day, a few chips. Basically I had not eaten all day. At some point I just felt like dancing to the music, probably just 5 minutes, but it felt much longer. It was quite enjoyable, yet not as intense as I had imagined DXM to be. So I decided to up my dose. At 9 o'clock I drank the rest of the bottle, which should equal 6.3 mg per kilogram of my body weight. After a while the experience reached an entirely new level. I could not walk straight anymore and a great feeling of euphoria overcame me. I changed rooms now and then, turned on the TV, did not understand anything, started dancing alone in a dark room again. Just felt really good. The experience was so pleasant and good that I decided to smoke some of my good AK-47, great weed. At about 10:15 I hit a bowl. Now everything changed. All of a sudden I was sitting in front of my computer, yet I knew not where I had come from and what I was doing, what I was going to do or anything at all. I just felt great and started hallucinating when I closed my eyes. I have no idea how this happened, but I visualized myself as Jesus flying over something. I can't remember what though. I had lots of other crazy hallucinations, but I do not remember specific details. I do remember lying down though and just feeling the music. Not only the music, but also the room. I could not feel my body anymore, but I was a part of the room, or moreover the room itself. Furthermore, I started hallucinating I was in the computer game I had played earlier. It was quite interesting to read about just this phenomenon on the internet the next day. Before my trip I had primarily informed myself about general effects, dosage and health risks. For about 2.5 hours I have no consecutive or coherent memory, but I remember lying on the floor in the sofa, just tripping, hallucinating and feeling great. After that I was in reality again. But coming down was not unpleasant at all, even if it seemed more or less abrupt. Soon after coming down I went to bed. It should have been at about 1:30. The next day I smoked, and DXM kicked in again. Yet not even nearly as strongly as the night before. Still I had the best fucking high ever from just smoking. It lasted about 5 hours, unbelievable since I am usually not high for more than 2 hours anymore. Nevertheless I intend to smoke less after this experience. Weed does not seem worth it anymore. It just seems like a cheap and short buzz compared to the intensity and depth of DXM. Yet I am not going to take DXM again for a few weeks. I can definitely see the potential of a psychological addiction. It just felt too good. Well, in conclusion I guess I have to say, wow. More than I could ever have imagined. In addition to a great experience, it also helped me deal with some personal problems which I am not going to elaborate on. To say the least, certain hallucinations dealt with personal problems, but never making the trip unpleasant, only bringing my attention to certain matters the next day. Smoking the next day was a good idea as far as my judgment goes. During this second much lighter trip I reflected upon the experiences, or at least what I could remember, made the night before. I personally had a great first experience and I'm glad I react so well to DXM. By the way, honey cough really doesn't taste that bad. Drinking it was no problem at all, and the only non-alcoholic beverage I usually drink is water.
I first took cough medicine to get high at age 18. I was having a really rough day and had a few dollars, so I spent them on some daytime cold/flu relief gel caps from the dollar store. I took 4 and about 3 hours later felt a numb and sedated yet hardly euphoric state. I didn't really start abusing DXM until I turned 19, about 7 months after the first time taking it recreationally. At this time, I took the gel caps I bought at the dollar store every day, probably 5 to 8 of them daily. In addition to this I smoked marijuana, which would produce extremely more potent highs than I had ever experienced. On one occasion I remember smoking synthetic marijuana or spice while high on DXM and having a physiologically scaring bad trip. After that I stopped smoking spice and continued using DXM every day. I felt drunk but hyper on DXM. I had insane mania that could keep me up all night and day. I felt goofy, I felt psychotic too. I had serious dissociations on DXM, such as while at work I felt like I was actually a rabbit in my rabbit hole poking my head out and talking to customers. I remember not ever really being mentally there, always being far gone in my dissociations and illusions. At this time in my town there was a huge news scandal that brought national attention and news reporters to the streets. I remember seeing news cameras and flipping them off as I walked by, but I was so out of it mentally I had no idea why any of them were there, even though the scandal was all anyone was talking about. That is how dissociated I was at this time. I hated my life, I hated my job, I hated everything, but DXM and weed were my escape and joy. My life was deteriorating around me and I chose to sign myself into an eating disorder clinic because I also was living with a serious case of bulimia and wanted recovery from that hell. I remember taking the last of my gel caps the morning my parents drove me to the hospital and then being clean from all drugs for several months after I went into recovery. A few months later my life started shaping up again. I had a plan. My eating habits were somewhat normal. I hadn't used DXM since before I left for recovery, and I occasionally smoked marijuana and had a spiritual enlightenment. Fast forward half a year later, I relapsed on my eating disorder, hard. Fast forward a few months after that, I started taking DXM again. At first I took the DXM to seem normal around my boyfriend. I met a guy, he was great, but love and sex for the first time seemed to bring all my demons to the surface again. I used the DXM to hide from those demons and feel normal and happy around him. around my family, around myself. Before I knew it, I was taking it every day again, increasing my amount over a period of months. I remember I liked the way it stopped my appetite so I couldn't binge anymore. The symptoms of my bulimia were fading only to be replaced by a new and dangerous addiction. It was around this time I found, brand name, and began taking it and tripping out for days because it was so strong. I am still thoroughly convinced, brand name, was created and is sold for people to abuse because it has such a high amount of DXM and better tasting flavor than normal cold medicine as well as long-lasting formula. I drank this stuff like milk, every day. In the beginning I took a third or half of a 3-ounce bottle a day but eventually started chugging an entire 3-ounce bottle a day every morning. I experienced extremely far-off mind states I can only describe as going into the light, paranoid delusions of people out to murder me, which I vocalized to my friends who looked at me very concerned as they didn't know about the drug abuse, no appetite, inability to sleep, inability to urinate or move my bowels, sometimes for days, overall mania and hyperactivity, general psychosis, and loss of touch with reality. After an entire winter and spring of daily abuse to the point I was chugging a 5-ounce bottle every day before work, my body began to shut down. One day after a long manic episode of no sleep/no food for days straight, I took 2 5-ounce bottles of grape, brand name, before work around 10 a.m. By 12:30 I was buzzing, I couldn't feel my legs, I kept thinking, wow, I'm an angel. Wow, I'm an angel. Then I used the restroom and tried to urinate but saw that instead I was bleeding from my bowels. This, even as far gone as I was mentally, I knew was a very bad sign. I looked at myself in the mirror. I'll never forget how it felt to see my reflection when I was dissociating. It was scary to me. I knew something was wrong, my mind couldn't work properly. I told my boss I had to lie down. When I lay down on the cot in the back, my vision was static. I could only see a small tunnel of light through the darkness that was taking over my vision. The only way I can describe the feeling of my body and mind was fried. My mind seemed to be vibrating and shaking as the darkness took over. I looked at what I could still see of the ceiling and desperately wanted to fall asleep because I was so endlessly tired. This was strange because DXM gave me mania and hyperactivity. What was happening at this time I later came to believe was my organs and nervous system shutting down, which I read as an effect of long-term DXM abuse and overdose. I knew if I gave in to the darkness in my vision, I would die. I think at this point, as dissociated as I was, survival mode and adrenaline kicked in as I walked outside and called an ambulance. I don't remember the hospital much in the beginning because I was still so out of it, but after they pumped my stomach and put a saline solution in my bloodstream, I started coming back into reality. I remember the doctor was condescending. He asked me why I abused DXM. I looked at him and said because it makes me feel like an angel. His reaction was pretty scared looking because of the irony of the situation I was in. I stopped taking DXM after that day. I told myself I would never take it again, until I did. I started abusing it again after my boyfriend and I broke up a few months after my overdose. This was in September 2013. I didn't take it as much as before, but I still abused it. My last day ever taking DXM was February 14, 2014. I don't really know why I stopped the use then, maybe because I had turned 21 and switched to gin. It's been over 2 years since the last time I took DXM and I have since refused to take it even when I am truly sick with a cold or flu. I rarely drink alcohol now, maybe 2 to 3 drinks a year. I have began a whole foods and mostly raw food diet to heal the damage the drug abuse did to my body, especially liver. It's easy to want to forget about this addiction and just move on with my life, but the truth is I was an addict and severely damaged my body. I still have my sharp mind and I am getting my health back with nutrition, mediation, and self-love. Turns out I was sexually abused as a small child for years and repressed all the memories. As I slowly worked through recovered the memories, I found the root of my bulimia, addiction, and hatred of my body. It also explains why the worst abuse and addiction of DXM came after I started having a sexual relationship for the first time. I was sexually dysfunctional and wanted to feel normal, so I turned to drugs to make it easier to have a normal sex life. That is the problem I have with the mental health system. It strives to eliminate the symptoms and put the client on prescription medicine without really getting to the root cause traumas. The thing about DXM is there's not a lot of research on it or any I have found on how it gets people high. What I think is it suppresses the nervous system to suppress the nerve reaction of coughing, which is fine in the small recommended dosages but very harmful in recreational doses. Plus all the other painkillers and chemicals found in over-the-counter cold medicine. All of this together equals not something you ever want to pour into your body on a daily basis unless you have a death wish, especially if your organs are already damaged from years of an eating disorder as mine were. Anyway, thank you for reading this. Recovery and total healing are completely possible with faith, love, and determination. For me it's been a long road full of many days where I didn't know how I'd function without my drugs, without my crutch. But I found a way to function and I found hope in my music and paintings. I found hope in helping my beautiful friends through their own hardships. I didn't die, I am only 23 and I have the best of my life ahead of me. All my love.
Hero would note, the doses described in this report are potentially life-threatening. The amount taken is beyond a heavy dose and could pose serious health risks or result in unwanted, extreme effects. Doses such as this have been known to cause hospitalizations and/or deaths. Sometimes extremely high doses reported are errors rather than actual doses used. After extensively researching the effects, side effects and long-term effects of DXM, I decided that I'd give it a go. At the time of this experience, about a year and 3 months ago now, I was feeling quite destitute, that is to say that I was condemned to a life of self-propagated ruination and that I was a hopeless lump of useless flesh. I'd recently been dumped by my girlfriend, who at the time had decided that I was too intense for her and that had screwed my brain over in many ways. I'd become adamantly self-destructive and no challenge, drug-based or otherwise, would worry me as long as there was opportunity to end my pitiful, post-pubescent life. So there I was, feeling wretched, after a long, hard day at work. I didn't particularly feel like doing anything constructive, so I dug out my Ziploc baggie of DXM and filled 400 size gel caps, which had previously contained kava kava, filling them tightly with the white powder. Licked my fingers and swallowed all 4, chased with minimal water. I then decided that I was feeling tired. This was around T+1 hour and I was starting to feel the effects of the robo, albeit much more intensely than usual, this dose having been the highest I'd had the trepidation to go through. I was extremely unsettled by the intensity, my muscles were becoming almost unbearably tense and I had extremely bad tinnitus, ringing in the ears. I could feel the muscles around my eyes being stretched to capacity, and this was becoming painful. I also noticed that I was drooling a lot, which was intriguing because I normally only experienced it with ketamine or agarics. The Simpsons were on the TV and had gained an extremely flat, photo-like quality, and the voices sounded like garbled, metallic gibberish. I switched off the TV and lay on my bed, realizing I had hugely overdosed and resigning to the fact that I'd either have to write it out or have somebody call a poison control center. A couple of my friends were downstairs and they said they'd come in and check periodically. I gave my friend, let's call him Helmet, a shout and explained my situation, barely coherently. He got the main gist and decided that it would be better if, firstly I took a paracetamol, and secondly, that he kept me company. I lay on my bed once more, while Helmet rolled what appeared to be a huge reefer. He offered me some and held it to my mouth. Not wanting to offend Helmet by declining his kind offer, I took perhaps 5 or 6 massive tokish and lay back once more, experiencing the most intense trip I'd ever experienced. Helmet had placed 9-inch nails the fragile, which was just exacerbating my escalating distressed state, and I could feel my sense of logic and reality rapidly dissolving. I remember looking at a few of my pictures on the wall. My sensory palette had become jumbled and blues had turned green, greens violet, reds gained a cloudy texture and the air gained a syrupy viscosity, another effect that I hadn't previously experienced. I tried explaining my distress to Helmet, who took time to comprehend. He dealt me the paracetamols, 2 times 500 milligrams, and gave me a cigarette. Despite the fact that I was quite heavily anesthetized, I managed to squirm my way into a comfortable position and meditate, concentrating on my heart chakra and my breathing. The state that followed left me in a state of delirious awe. Never had I witnessed such awesome effects from DXM, but I'll try my best to describe them. After a few minutes of concentrating on my breathing, and listening to my heart, which I could feel pounding through my ribcage, a reassuring sensation. I hadn't completely lost sensory perception yet. I started to feel a strong vibration at my crown chakra. The deeper I would breathe, the stronger it would get. This would have all been quite normal, except for the fact that it wasn't synchronized with my heartbeat. It was a separate rhythm, and as far as I could tell in my delusional state, it meant I had assimilated the aura of somebody else. As I continued concentrating, this sensation immersed my entire body. It stabbed at my nerve cells and made my body feel alive with energy. How ironic that around that time, I fell asleep. After awakening, Helmut was still awake, albeit very, very stoned from what he told me later, and he'd informed me that it was around 5 in the morning, and that I'd been asleep roughly 3 hours. My hearing had become so muffled and tinny that it was hard to adhere to whatever was on the telly at the time. I peered out of my bedroom window and noticed that the sky looked green. I could smell the sweat soaked into my clothes, and I could barely move through stiffness. Helmut had smoked his way through a quarter of weed and was offering me a few tokish on yet another enormous spliff. A few more tokish, and I was back in the state I was in a few hours previously. Everything had been tinted gray in the morning light of the Kentish sunrise. The sky was still green. I felt completely overwhelmed. I didn't know where the hell I was, who the hell I was, or what the hell Helmut was. His eyes bulged out of his face, his neck constantly extended and contracted. The walls contorted and pulsated with this bizarre rhythm I was still experiencing. I winked at the hallucinations I saw. I watched a neon green caterpillar scale the side of my television, disappear and consequently reappear from Helmut's arm. I became convinced that I was a bizarre, multi-tendrilled creature from a faraway land, and that I was sitting at the pinnacle of a huge mountain. I look at my hand and it would seem 20 times the size of my head. The most interesting effect would be when I peered at the wall next to my bed. I could see through it, and I was able to create an extension of my bedroom in my mind's eye, with various yellow leaf trees and hopping, spring-mounted creatures, which spewed rainbow-colored nebulae gas. Between my waking times, which were all too sporadic, I'd become lost in a sleepy, delusional world. I'd become confused over my identity, and I'd metamorphose into various imaginary characters, awakening into further confusion over who the hell I was and where the hell I was. This state lasted, to the best of my knowledge, 12 hours. At 4 in the afternoon, when I'd returned a little closer to reality, I got up and shakily went to make myself a cup of tea. I took 2 more paracetamol and devoured what remained of my lucky strikes. I felt physically exhausted, and unpleasantly sick. I still felt confused over this previous identity crisis, but I managed to piece together what had happened. As soon as my motor skills were usable again, I went and played around with the vaults of a reputable harm reduction website, and eventually to the DXM FAQ. I'd read about Plateau Sigma before, but when the time came, I found that I was too keen to identify it until afterwards. From what was described on the FAQ, most of it I had experienced: auditory hallucinations, visual hallucinations and confusion, which was dominant throughout the entire experience. I'd probably destroyed a sizable chunk of my brain in the process, and yes, adhering to the FAQ, it was an extremely unpleasant but intriguing state of consciousness, worth further exploration despite the risks. So there we have it. In conclusion, there wasn't much else I could have done to prepare myself for Plateau Sigma, although it came with plenty of warning. Extreme trip intensity, I suppose. It definitely took me off guard, as the delusion it imbibes overshadows all reasoning. Therefore, I learned from this experience firstly how Plateau Sigma manifests itself, and secondly, precautionary measures which should have been common sense anyway. Funny how some people have to be knocked for 6 before they realize what's happened, but that's how people's minds and logic work. Prior to this experience, I've taken a few second and third Plateau's doses and found that they induce a state-dependent memory and recollection. I could remember and indeed feel many aspects of my previous Sigma trip, which were previously not experienced at these plateaus. The state-dependent memory has proven itself useful already. I'm currently taking a course in programming in JavaScript, and I find that I can link the rowboat procedures in this course virtually without inhibition or restraint. Wonders will never cease. Peace. I sat at home, kind of annoyed that my friend with drug connections was not going to deliver the acid I had asked him for. He hated me using him for drugs, and I guess I don't blame him. At that moment, though, I was just annoyed and disappointed. I wanted some kind of trip and had no way to get it. I remember on the net seeing something about Dramamine and diphenhydramine being able to give some pretty intense trips. I opened up the Dramamine FAQ and after reading it, promptly decided I wasn't gonna get anywhere near the stuff. Somewhere however it mentioned DXM. I proceeded to the DXM FAQ and was enthralled. I decided to try a second Plateau trip first, so the next day I went to the store and purchased a 4-ounce bottle of Robitussin, making sure DXM was the only active ingredient. I had an interesting time and the next night decided to increase my dose and perhaps make it to the third Plateau. For this I purchased 2 4-ounce bottles. I drank all of the first one. It tasted noticeably worse than the night before. I then drank half the second one and poured the rest out. I had to pour out the rest because when on drugs I have no self-control, having once gone through 12 hits of MDMA in a 12-hour period. At first I was disappointed, it seemed to be taking longer to take effect this time. At T+2 hours, I was barely feeling anything. I was getting eye rolls very reminiscent of MDMA, but very little else. I conversed with my friends on ICQ for a while, and was able to keep up with the conversations without any problem. Somewhere around T+2 hours and 30 minutes, I started to feel something like nausea. I say something like nausea because though it felt a lot like normal nausea, I didn't think I was in any danger of actually puking. Halfway through typing a message to a friend, I suddenly felt as though I were being tossed back and forth 30 degrees from vertical on each side, violently. I closed my eyes and I could feel my hands holding on to my computer desk, but I still felt like I was being tossed back and forth. The combined sensations gave me the queer feeling that my brain was being tossed back and forth in my skull. I'm sure some people would have found this, accompanied with the nausea, to be extremely unpleasant. All I could think was, now we're going to have some fun. The tossing passed in a moment or two, but the nausea increased significantly. I started to wrap up the conversations I had going on. My judgment must have been skewed because I asked my friend if he had done ketamine, and indeed he had, and I told him I was on DXM and mentioned they might have similar effects. I disconnected from my ISP and thought about what I should do next. I think it was about T+3 hours, at this point, but I'm not really sure. I had intended to keep notes about the experience, trying to write something every half hour if possible, but after T+2 hours and 30 minutes, I either forgot or decided it wasn't worth the effort. I dimmed the lights. The trance I had playing was getting to be a little overwhelming, and I didn't feel like I was up to picking something else out, so I just shut off the music and lay down on my bed. Unfortunately, my memory gets fuzzy here. I had taken Somdme ahead of time, in the hope that it might help me remember more, but it didn't seem to help much. I remember regretting taking the DXM a little, but I wasn't ever scared. At some point, complete dissociation set in, and this is where my memory picks up again. My eyes were closed, I think. I was seeing waving geometric patterns, very reminiscent of random dot stereograms of sine waves except with simple patterns instead of random dots, and I felt like I was flying. This went on for some time. After a while, I must have forgotten I was human. That is the only way I can describe what happened next. I began to wonder what I was. Not who, but what. I struggled with this thought for a while, still flying about in space with wavy geometric patterns in the background. After much struggle, my mind managed to unearth what I was. I remembered my name. I repeated it over and over several times, trying to figure out what it meant to be. I opened my eyes and saw my room about me. The first odd thing that struck me was the bed. "What is this for?" I asked. The word sleep appeared to me. I remembered what sleep was. I didn't believe it, simply could not believe it. It seemed so illogical that for half of my existence I would lie on a bed and wait for unconsciousness to come. Next, more images came to me about what my human life was about, images of getting up out of bed, images of getting in my car, images of being at work. I couldn't make sense of the whole 3D space thing, so the fact that I had to drive to work every day struck me as absurd. But then the strangest, most wondrous fact occurred to me. I realized that there was a time that I couldn't really remember very well, and this time was known as school, specifically elementary school. Scrolling words drove out my visions of waving patterns: first grade, second grade, third grade, child. I wondered briefly if I was a child now. My next source of puzzlement was what I had done before I was a child. Again text scrolled: 1900s, 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, 1500s, Rome, Socrates, Aristotle. The idea of there being a time that I didn't exist struck me as an obvious logical impossibility. Then I imagined places where I was not, but I couldn't mentally differentiate between times I had not existed and places I was not at. Images of maps of Europe and colonial America puzzled me for several minutes. I could write about how I further struggled with the concepts of humanity and mortality, but I've already written quite a bit. What was it that eventually convinced me I was one of those funny-looking human being things whose images populated my memory banks? Thirst. It either became strong enough to break through the wall of DXM, or the dissociative effects were beginning to taper off. At first, I just finished off the little bit of water I had within arm's reach and went back to being puzzled about what I am, but the thirst came back quickly. I realized that indeed I might be human, and that whatever I was, drinking some water was going to make me feel a whole lot better. I couldn't stand. Or at least I thought I couldn't. I imagined myself several feet above the ground, held up by only these jointed and spindly appendages. I decided crawling was my best bet. Crawling felt strange. My arms and legs seemed detached in some sense. Not physically detached, but they seemed extra somehow. It was like I was just my head and chest, and the rest of me was just kind of tacked on. In a moment of lucidity that lasted about as long as it took me to get across the room to the water, I remembered a line from a DXM trip report I had read. It was bad trip report, and the person had highlighted how bad it was because she had had to crawl to the bathroom, and that she hadn't had to crawl in many years and how awful the feeling was to have to crawl. What's so bad about this? I thought as I crawled to the other end of the room. I had expected the quenching of my thirst to be pleasurable, as it normally is for me when I drink when I'm really thirsty, but instead it just made the awful feeling of being thirsty go away. I crawled back to bed, attempting to stand once on the way. I only got as far as kneeling before I chickened out. The clock indicated it was T+6 hours. I lay on the bed and noticed then that I was pretty much completely numb. I tried touching myself several places, and though I could feel the impact, perhaps kinesthetic sense, I couldn't feel anything at the skin level. My skin was covered in sweat, and my t-shirt was soaked. My heart rate was high. How high, I couldn't figure out. The beats seemed to echo a little, and really the idea of counting past 5 seemed pretty intimidating. I was a little nervous at the rate it was going. I think I would have been really scared at that point, but I had done a lot of ephedrine as a kid, so I knew how incredibly fast my heart could beat without me dying. From there, what I remember of the trip was fairly uneventful. My heart calmed down in about half an hour. For the next few hours I drifted in and out of what can best be described as waking dreams. Of these I remember very little, except that I thought they were pretty cool at the time. About T+9 hours, I fell asleep. When I awoke, I discovered that the blanket I had slept on was wet. I don't know whether I spilled water on it, or if I really did sweat that much. I wonder if the high heart rate and diaphoresis might have been caused by Celexa that was in my system. I had taken just one 15 mg tablet of Celexa 5 days before. I had read of the possibility of serotonin syndrome when combining DXM with SSRIs, but had figured 5 days was enough for 15 mg to be out of my system. I should have looked up the half-life of Celexa before taking the DXM. Another possibility is that some DXM, or DXO, a DXM metabolite, was still in my system from the night before. Right before I drank the cough syrup, I remember thinking that my tongue was still a little numb and that I might have some still in my system. Overall, I must rate the trip a positive experience, though the effect it had on my heart makes me leery to try that high a dose again.